I inherited a mansion from my late son, and that same week my daughter-in-law showed up at my door with her parents. We want you out. We need space and we won't support a useless old woman. I just pointed to the window. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I inherited a mansion from my deceased son, and in the same week my daughter-in-law knocked on my door with her parents. We want you out. We need space and don't want to support a useless old woman. I just pointed to the window. The funeral flowers were still wilting on the kitchen counter when they came. 3 sharp knocks that seemed to echo through the empty halls of the mansion Samuel had left me. I was sitting in his old leather chair, the one that still smelled faintly of his cologne, holding the deed to this house in my trembling hands. The lawyer had delivered it just 4 days ago, along with a letter from Samuel that I hadn't been able to bring myself to read yet. When I opened the heavy oak door, my heart sank. There stood Ava, my 28-year-old daughter-in-law, flanked by her parents like some kind of intervention committee. Her mother, Patricia, wore that pinched expression she always had around me, as if I were something unpleasant she'd stepped in. Her father, Robert, looked uncomfortable but determined, his jaw set in that way men get when they've been convinced to do something they don't particularly want to do. Karen, Ava said, not bothering with pleasantries, we need to talk. I stepped aside, my heart already racing. Something about their formation, their expressions felt predatory. They filed into the grand foyer, and I noticed how Ava's eyes swept over the crystal chandelier, the marble staircase, the oil paintings that had hung there since Samuel bought this place 5 years ago. She wasn't looking at them with grief or nostalgia. She was calculating. Please sit down, I offered, gesturing toward the living room. My voice came out smaller than I intended. We'd rather stand, Patricia said curtly. This won't take long. Ava crossed her arms, and I saw something cold and hard in her green eyes that made my stomach clench. Karen, we've been talking, and we've decided that this arrangement isn't going to work. What arrangement? I asked, though part of me already knew where this was heading. You living here, Robert said, speaking for the first time. His voice was flat, businesslike. It's not practical. Ava and Patricia need space to grieve, and frankly, we don't think it's fair for us to have to support you. The words hit me like a physical blow. Support me? I'd been living off my meager savings and Samuel's small life insurance policy, paying for my own groceries, utilities, everything. I hadn't asked them for a single penny. I don't understand, I said, sinking into the nearest chair. This is my home now. Samuel left it to me. Ava's laugh was sharp and bitter. Your home? Karen, let's be realistic here. You're 63 years old, you have no income. No savings worth mentioning. How exactly do you plan to maintain a place like this? The property taxes alone are more than you made in a year at that little cleaning job of yours. Each word was like a knife twisting in my chest. The cleaning job she mentioned so dismissively was how I'd supported myself after my husband died 12 years ago. It was honest work, and I'd been proud of it, even if it meant scrubbing other people's toilets and bathrooms until my knees ached and my hands cracked from the chemicals. Samuel wanted me to have it, I whispered, clutching the deed tighter. Samuel was sick, Patricia interjected, her voice sharp with impatience. He wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. We all know that. This house should go to Ava. She's young, she has her whole life ahead of her. What are you going to do with all this space? Rattle around like some old ghost? I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I blinked them back. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. He was my son. And she was his wife, Robert said firmly. The primary relationship. You had your time raising him. Now it's her turn to build her future. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. As if my relationship with Samuel, 34 years of loving him, raising him, sacrificing for him, was somehow secondary to a marriage that had lasted only 3 years. 3 years during which I'd watched Ava slowly isolate him from me, making excuses for why I couldn't visit, why family dinners had to be canceled, why she was always too busy when I called. We've already spoken to a realtor, Ava said, pulling out her phone. The market is hot right now. A place like this could sell for well over $1 million. After expenses, there would be enough to set you up in a nice little apartment somewhere, maybe even a retirement community. Wouldn't that be better? Being around people your own age. My own age. As if 63 made me ancient, useless, ready to be shuffled off to die quietly somewhere out of sight. I thought about the retirement community she was probably envisioning. One of those grim places where old people went to wait for death, playing bingo and watching game shows until their minds turned to mush. I don't want to sell, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Ava's expression hardened. Karen, you're not being reasonable. Look around you. This place is huge. The heating bills alone would bankrupt you. And frankly, I don't think any of us should have to worry about supporting a stubborn old woman who won't face reality. There it was. The real reason. They didn't want to be responsible for me, didn't want to risk me becoming a burden on their finances. The irony was almost laughable. For the past 3 years, during Samuel's illness, I'd been the one sending money when I could, helping with medical bills, groceries, anything they needed. I'd maxed out my credit cards, taken extra cleaning jobs, even sold my mother's wedding ring to help pay for his treatments. But they didn't remember that. Or maybe they just didn't care. You can't make me leave, I said quietly. Patricia stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. Can't we? Karen, you have no money, no way to maintain this place. How long do you think you can last before you're forced to sell anyway? Why not do it now while the market is good, and save yourself the humiliation? Humiliation. The word hung in the air like a threat. I could see it in their faces. They'd already decided I was pathetic, a burden, a problem to be solved. In their minds, I was already defeated. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky but my resolve growing stronger. This is Samuel's house. He left it to me for a reason. Samuel felt guilty, Ava said bluntly. Guilty because he knew you'd sacrifice for him, and he wanted to ease his conscience before he died. But that doesn't mean it was the right decision. That doesn't mean we have to live with the consequences of his guilt. The casual way she dismissed my son's final wishes, the love and thought that had gone into his decision, made something inside me snap. But before I could respond, she continued, We'll give you 2 weeks to make arrangements. That should be plenty of time to find somewhere else to go. 2 weeks. As if 34 years of motherhood, 3 years of watching my son slowly die, a lifetime of sacrifice and love could be packed up and moved in 2 weeks. They turned to leave, and I followed them to the door on unsteady legs. As they walked down the front steps, I heard Patricia say to her husband, Thank God that's over. I was afraid she'd make a scene. I closed the door and leaned against it, my whole body shaking. The house felt impossibly large around me, every room an echo of Samuel's absence. But it also felt like the last piece of him I had left, the last place where his memory lived, in the walls, in the rooms he'd chosen, in the dreams he'd had for the future. Standing there in the silence, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. They weren't just trying to take my home. They were trying to erase me completely, to remove every trace of my connection to Samuel, to make it as if I'd never existed in his life at all. But I was his mother. And mothers don't give up that easily. That night I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the empty rooms of the mansion, each one holding memories that felt both precious and painful. The guest bedroom where Samuel had recovered from his first surgery. The kitchen where I'd made him soup when he was too weak to eat solid food. The study where he'd spent his final months, too sick to work but too stubborn to give up completely. I found myself standing in his bedroom doorway, looking at the bed where he'd taken his last breath just 10 days ago. Ava had already removed most of his personal belongings, his clothes, his books, even the prescription bottles from his nightstand. It was as if she was erasing him as efficiently as she was trying to erase me. The memories came flooding back, uninvited but unstoppable. I remembered the day Samuel first brought Ava home to meet me, how excited he'd been, how he'd held her hand and looked at her like she was the most wonderful thing in the world. She'd been charming that day, sweet and attentive, asking about my garden and complimenting my cooking. I'd been so happy for him, so relieved that he'd found someone to love. I should have seen the signs earlier. The way she gradually started scheduling their visits during times when she knew I was working. How she'd suggest restaurants I couldn't afford when we went out together, then act surprised when I had to decline. The little comments about how old-fashioned my house was, how Samuel deserved better than visiting his mother in my modest 2-bedroom rental. But it was during Samuel's illness that her true nature really emerged. The first diagnosis came 3 years ago. Stage 2 colon cancer, treatable but requiring aggressive chemotherapy. I remember sitting in that sterile doctor's office, watching my son's face crumble as the oncologist explained the treatment plan, the side effects, the long road ahead. That night, I told Samuel I would help however I could. I meant it with every fiber of my being. My boy was sick and nothing else mattered. I started by taking extra cleaning shifts, sometimes working 14-hour days to bring in more money. My regular clients were understanding. Mrs. Peterson even gave me a bonus when she learned about Samuel's diagnosis. I cleaned houses until my back screamed and my hands were raw, but every extra dollar went toward his medical bills. When the insurance company denied coverage for one of his treatments, claiming it was experimental, I sold my mother's engagement ring. It was the only valuable thing I owned, a small diamond that had been in our family for 60 years. I got $800 for it. Not much, but enough to help with that month's copay. I drove Samuel to his chemotherapy appointments when Ava was too busy or too emotional to handle it. I sat in those awful plastic chairs for hours, watching the poison drip into his veins, holding his hand when the nausea hit, bringing him homemade ginger cookies because they were the only thing he could keep down. Ava would show up at the end of the sessions, fresh from the salon or shopping, acting like the devoted wife for the nurses and other patients. She'd fuss over Samuel, stroke his thinning hair, and talk about how hard this was on her, how she was barely sleeping from worry. The nurses would coo over what a devoted couple they were, and I would sit there invisible, just another old woman in a plastic chair. The worst part was watching Samuel pull away from me. At first, I thought it was just the exhaustion from treatment, the way cancer steals not just your strength but your ability to connect with others. But gradually, I realized Ava was orchestrating it. She'd schedule his doctor's appointments without telling me, then act surprised when I showed up uninformed. She'd plan family dinners and forget to invite me until the last minute, if at all. "Mom, you don't need to come to every appointment," Samuel told me one day, avoiding my eyes. "Ava's handling everything now. You should focus on taking care of yourself." Taking care of myself. As if watching my son fight for his life wasn't exactly the most important thing I could possibly do for myself. But I could see the exhaustion in his face, the way this illness was eating away at more than just his body. He was tired of being sick, tired of being dependent, tired of the constant medical drama. If limiting my involvement made things easier for him, I would step back. So I did. I stopped calling as often, stopped showing up unannounced with food or offers to help. I waited for invitations that came less and less frequently. When they did include me, Ava would spend the entire time on her phone or talking about people I didn't know, making it clear that I was an obligation, not a welcome guest. The isolation was devastating. For 31 years, Samuel had been the center of my world. After his father died, he was all I had left. Watching him slip away, not just physically but emotionally, felt like dying a slow death myself. I remember one particularly awful evening about a year into his treatment. I'd made his favorite lasagna and driven to their house unannounced, something I'd done hundreds of times before. When Ava answered the door, she looked annoyed. "Karen, we weren't expecting you." "I brought dinner," I said, holding up the casserole dish. Samuel mentioned he was having trouble keeping food down, so I made the lasagna the way he likes it, with extra cheese. She didn't invite me in. Actually, we already ate. And Samuel's sleeping. He had a really rough day. Through the doorway, I could see into their living room. Samuel was sitting on the couch, clearly awake, watching television. When he saw me, he looked away quickly, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. "Maybe I could just say hello," I said, my voice getting smaller. "I really think it's better if you don't," Ava said firmly. "He needs his rest. You understand." I stood there on their doorstep, holding a lasagna I'd spent 3 hours making, being turned away from seeing my own son. The worst part was that Samuel didn't even try to intervene. He just sat there letting it happen. That night, I went home and cried until I had no tears left. Then I ate the entire lasagna by myself, sitting alone at my kitchen table, tasting my own disappointment with every bite. The pattern continued for months. I was allowed to visit when it was convenient for Ava, which wasn't often. Phone calls were kept short. When Samuel's condition worsened and he ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks, Ava controlled the visiting schedule like a security guard, limiting me to 1 hour every other day while her friends and family came and went freely. The doctor says too many visitors tire him out, she explained, though I noticed her college roommate was allowed to stay for 3 hours the day before. I began to feel like a stranger in my own son's life. The nurses didn't know who I was. His doctors had never met me. When people asked about Samuel's family, they meant Ava. I was just some old woman who showed up occasionally, increasingly irrelevant to his care and his world. The financial strain was crushing me. I'd taken on so many extra cleaning jobs that I was working 7 days a week, sometimes starting at 5 in the morning and not finishing until after dark. My body was breaking down, my knees ached constantly. My hands were permanently stained from cleaning chemicals, and I'd lost 20 pounds from stress and exhaustion. But I kept going because Samuel needed me, even if he didn't seem to want me anymore. Even if every interaction felt like an imposition, every phone call like an interruption, every offer to help like a burden he was too polite to refuse. The end came faster than anyone expected. Samuel's cancer returned more aggressively than before, and within 6 months, he was gone. I wasn't there when he died. Ava called me 3 hours after it happened, her voice flat and tired. "It's over," she said simply. He went peacefully in his sleep. I had rushed to the hospital, but his body was already gone. I never got to say goodbye, never got to hold his hand one last time, never got to tell him how proud I was of him, how much I loved him, how sorry I was for whatever I'd done wrong that made him pull away from me in his final months. Now, standing in his empty bedroom, I realized something that made my chest ache with a familiar pain. Ava hadn't just taken Samuel away from me during his illness. She'd been preparing for this moment all along. The moment when she could erase me completely from his life, his memory, his legacy. The mansion around me felt like a monument to everything I'd lost, and everything they were determined to take away from me. But it was also the last gift my son had given me, the last proof that somewhere in his heart, he'd still loved his mother. I wasn't going to let them take that away from me, not without a fight. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of voices outside. Through the bedroom window, I could see Ava standing on the front lawn with a man in an expensive suit, gesturing toward the house like she already owned it. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. She was already moving forward with her plans, treating my home like it was hers to sell. I quickly dressed and hurried downstairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold marble floor. By the time I reached the front door, they were walking around the side of the house, the man taking notes on a clipboard while Ava pointed out various features. "The garden could use some updating," I heard her say as I stepped outside. "But the bones of the landscaping are solid. Very expensive when it was first installed." "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. They both turned, and I saw irritation flash across Ava's face. The man looked confused, glancing between us. "Karen, this is David Morrison from Prestige Properties," Ava said smoothly. "David, this is my late husband's mother. She's been staying here temporarily while we sort out the estate." Temporarily. The word hit me like a slap. She was already rewriting history, making me sound like a guest who had overstayed her welcome rather than the rightful owner of this house. "Actually," I said, finding my voice, "I'm the owner of this property. Samuel left it to me in his will." David looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between us. "I see. Well, perhaps this is something you two need to discuss privately. I can come back another time." "That won't be necessary," Ava said quickly. "There's just been some confusion about the paperwork. Nothing that can't be sorted out." She gave him a smile that looked genuine if you didn't know her like I did. "Why don't you go ahead and do your assessment? I'll handle this family matter." After David walked away, disappearing around the back of the house, Ava turned to me with cold fury in her eyes. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "This is my house," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You can't just bring realtors here without my permission." She laughed, a sharp sound that made me flinch. "Your house? Karen, let's be realistic. How long do you think you can actually keep this place? The property taxes alone are $15,000 a year. The heating bill last winter was over $3,000. The insurance, the maintenance, the utilities. It's going to cost you at least $50,000 a year just to keep the lights on." I felt my stomach clench. I knew she was right about the expenses. I'd been so focused on the emotional significance of Samuel's gift that I hadn't really calculated what it would cost to maintain. My entire yearly income from Social Security and the small pension from my cleaning job was less than $30,000. I'll figure it out, I said weakly. How? Ava's voice was sharp with impatience. You going to go back to scrubbing toilets at your age? Maybe take on some evening shifts at the diner? She looked me up and down dismissively. Karen, you're 63 years old. You have arthritis in your hands, your knees are shot from all that cleaning, and you probably don't have $10,000 to your name. This is fantasy, not planning. Each word was like a needle finding exactly the right spot to inflict maximum pain. She knew about my arthritis because I'd mentioned it to Samuel when I'd had to cut back on some of my cleaning jobs. She knew about my financial situation because I'd been honest about my limitations when trying to help with his medical bills. She was using my own vulnerabilities against me, turning my honesty into weapons. Samuel wanted me to have this house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Samuel was dying, Ava replied brutally. He wasn't thinking clearly. He felt guilty about the way things had been between you two. So he made an impulsive decision that doesn't make any practical sense. The way things had been between you two. As if the distance in our relationship had been mutual. As if I had chosen to be excluded from my son's final months. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I'm not leaving, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Ava stepped closer, and I could smell her expensive perfume. See the perfect application of her makeup. Everything about her spoke of money, security, a future that didn't include struggling to pay bills or worrying about where the next meal would come from. You will, she said quietly, because you don't have a choice. I give you 1 month before you're completely broke and begging me to help you sell this place. And when that happens, I'm not going to be nearly as generous as I'm being now. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the garden Samuel had loved, surrounded by roses he'd planted but would never see bloom again. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. Ava started showing up at the house with different people, contractors, designers, even a landscaper. They would walk through the rooms as if I wasn't there, discussing changes they wanted to make, improvements that would increase the property value. We could knock out this wall, I heard one contractor say as they stood in the living room where I was trying to read. Open up the whole first floor. Make it more modern. I love that idea, Ava replied enthusiastically. Samuel always said this place felt too compartmentalized. He would have wanted it to be more open, more welcoming. It was a lie. Samuel had loved the traditional layout of the house, the way each room had its own character and purpose. But she was rewriting his preferences to suit her plans, using his memory to justify changes he never would have wanted. I tried to assert myself to remind them that this was still my home, but they treated me like furniture, something to be worked around rather than consulted. When I objected to their plans, Ava would give me a patronizing smile and say something like, "Of course, nothing will be decided until the ownership situation is resolved." The ownership situation? As if there was any question, as if Samuel's will wasn't crystal clear about his intentions. But doubt was creeping in. Late at night, lying in the master bedroom that still smelled faintly of Samuel's cologne, I would stare at the ceiling and wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I was being selfish, clinging to something I couldn't afford to keep. Maybe the responsible thing would be to sell, take whatever money was left after expenses, and find a small apartment somewhere. The isolation was the worst part. I had no family left except for a distant cousin in Oregon whom I hadn't spoken to in years. My few friends were other women who cleaned houses, and most of them lived paycheck to paycheck just like I did. I couldn't ask them for advice about what to do with $1 million mansion. They wouldn't understand the problem any more than I did. Samuel's friends, the people who had known him since college, had all disappeared after the funeral. They sent flowers and cards, but no one called to check on me. No one invited me for coffee or offered support. In their minds, I was just the mother, a minor character in Samuel's life story now that the main narrative was over. The worst moment came a week after my confrontation with Ava. I was in the kitchen trying to figure out how to work the expensive coffee machine Samuel had bought, when I heard voices in the foyer. Through the doorway I could see Ava with Patricia and Robert, along with a woman I didn't recognize carrying a briefcase. The thing is, Ava was saying, she's not thinking rationally. Grief does that to people, especially older people. They make emotional decisions that don't make any practical sense. It's actually quite common, the woman with the briefcase said. We see this a lot with elderly people who inherit property they can't afford to maintain. They become emotionally attached and refuse to see reason, even when keeping the property would bankrupt them. Elderly people. As if 63 made me senile, incapable of making my own decisions. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. What are our options? Robert asked. Well, if she's truly incompetent to manage her affairs, there are legal avenues, the woman replied. We could petition for guardianship, argue that she's not capable of making sound financial decisions. It's a lengthy process, but given the circumstances. They were talking about having me declared incompetent, taking away not just my house but my basic rights as an adult human being. The casual way they discussed it, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person with feelings and rights, made me feel sick. I backed away from the doorway, my heart pounding. They weren't just trying to take my home anymore. They were trying to take my freedom, my dignity, my very identity as an autonomous person. That night I sat in Samuel's study, surrounded by his books and papers, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I picked up the framed photo on his desk. A picture of the two of us from his college graduation, both of us smiling and proud. He had his arm around my shoulders, and I was looking at him with such love and pride that it hurt to see it now. What would you want me to do? I whispered to the empty room. What would you really want? But Samuel was gone, and I was on my own. For the first time since this nightmare began, I seriously considered giving up. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being foolish, clinging to something I couldn't handle. Maybe the smart thing would be to surrender, take whatever money I could get, and try to build some kind of life with what was left. I was reaching for the phone to call Ava and tell her she'd won when I noticed something I'd missed before. Samuel's desk drawer was slightly open, and there was a corner of paper sticking out. Something about it looked different from his usual documents, older, more yellowed with age. My hands trembling, I pulled the drawer open completely. Inside, beneath a stack of medical bills and insurance forms, was a manila envelope with my name written on it in Samuel's handwriting. The paper was thick, expensive, and the envelope was sealed with wax. Something Samuel only did for very important documents. As I held that envelope in my shaking hands, I realized that maybe I didn't know the whole story after all. Maybe Samuel had left me more than just a house. Maybe he'd left me the truth. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely break the wax seal. The envelope felt heavy, weighted with more than just paper. As I carefully opened it, several documents fell onto Samuel's desk, along with a letter written in his familiar handwriting. The first thing I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Bank statements, phone records, credit card bills. But not Samuel's. These were all in Ava's name, dating back to the early months of his illness. My heart pounded as I picked up the top bank statement and saw deposits I couldn't understand. Large amounts of money, appearing monthly, from something called Executive Consulting Services. I had never heard Ava mention any job, any consulting work. During Samuel's entire illness, she had claimed to be too devastated, too overwhelmed with caregiving duties to work. She talked constantly about the financial strain, how they were struggling to pay medical bills, how grateful she was for any help I could provide. But according to these bank statements, she had been earning more money than Samuel ever had, even before he got sick. With trembling fingers, I picked up Samuel's letter. The date at the top was just 6 weeks before he died. Mom, it began, and I could almost hear his voice speaking the words. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I hope you found this before it was too late. I need you to know the truth about things I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I sank into his desk chair, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. I know you think Ava loved me. I know you blame yourself for the distance between us in my final months. Mom, you need to know that none of it was your fault. Ava has been lying to both of us from the very beginning. My vision blurred with tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. The consulting work she's been doing? It's not consulting. She's been having an affair with her boss, Marcus Webb, since 6 months after we got married. She's been taking money from him, expensive gifts, trips she told me were work conferences. I have proof, Mom. I hired a private investigator. The room felt like it was spinning. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself as I continued reading. I found out about the affair 8 months ago, when I was going through her purse looking for my insurance card, and found hotel receipts for places she'd never mentioned staying. At first, I thought maybe it was innocent, maybe just poor record keeping. But when I started paying attention, really watching, I saw the signs everywhere. I thought about all those times Ava had been too busy to come to Samuel's doctor appointments, all the work trips and conferences that seemed to multiply as his condition worsened. She hadn't been overwhelmed by his illness. She'd been relieved to have an excuse to spend more time with her lover. I hired an investigator named Robert Chun. He followed her for 3 weeks and got everything we needed. Photos, financial records, even recordings of phone calls. She's been stealing money from our joint accounts to pay for gifts for Marcus. Expensive watches, trips to wine country, even a car. Money we needed for my medical treatments. Money you were breaking your back to help us replace. I felt sick. All those extra cleaning jobs, all those 14-hour days, selling my mother's ring. It had all been to replace money Ava was stealing to fund her affair. The worst part, Mom, is what she said about you. I have recordings of her talking to Marcus about her plans. She calls you a pathetic old woman, and says she can't wait to get rid of you permanently. She told him that once I die, she's going to make sure you have no place in our family, that she'll find a way to get you out of our lives completely. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I kept reading. She's been poisoning me against you, Mom. Every time you called, she'd tell me you sounded drunk or confused. When you sent cards or gifts, she'd hide them and tell me you forgot my birthday or our anniversary. She made me believe you were pulling away from me, when really she was building a wall between us. I thought about all those missed phone calls, all the times Samuel seemed distracted or distant when I visited. I thought he was tired from treatment, overwhelmed by his illness. I never imagined someone was actively working to destroy our relationship. I wanted to confront her, to divorce her immediately. But then the cancer came back and I realized I might not have much time left. I couldn't bear the thought of spending my final months in a bitter legal battle. So I made a different plan. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I changed my will without telling her. Everything goes to you, the house, my life insurance, my retirement accounts, everything. She thinks she's inheriting it all, but she's not getting a penny. I also made sure to document everything about her affair, her theft, her lies. It's all in the safe behind the painting in my bedroom. I looked up from the letter, my mind reeling. There was a safe behind the painting in his bedroom? In 3 weeks of living in this house, I'd never noticed it. The combination is your birthday month, day, year. Mom, I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I never stopped needing you. Ava made me feel like I was a burden to you, like my illness was too much for you to handle. She convinced me that protecting you from the worst of it was an act of love. I see now that I was protecting her secrets, not your feelings. I could barely see the page through my tears. I'm sorry I pulled away. I'm sorry I let her come between us. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth while I was alive. But I hope this house, this gift, will show you how much you meant to me. You were the best mother any son could ask for. You sacrificed everything for me, and I want you to have security for the rest of your life. The letter was signed simply Samuel, with a postscript that made my blood run cold. P.S. Ava doesn't know about any of this. She's expecting to inherit everything. When she finds out the truth, she's going to be furious. Be careful, Mom. I've seen what she's capable of when she doesn't get her way. I set the letter down with shaking hands and looked at the other documents in the envelope. Bank records showing Ava's secret accounts. Credit card statements for purchases I'd never seen her make. Hotel receipts for romantic weekends she'd taken while Samuel was in chemotherapy. But the worst was a transcript of a phone conversation between Ava and Marcus, dated just 2 weeks before Samuel died. He's getting worse, Ava's voice said. The doctors think maybe another month or 2. And then, Marcus replied, then I'm free. The life insurance alone is $300,000, plus the house, plus his retirement accounts. We'll have enough to start over anywhere we want. What about his mother? Ava's laugh was cold and cruel. What about her? She's a nobody. An old cleaning lady with no money and no connections. Once Samuel's gone, I never have to see her again. I'm thinking of telling her the house needs too much work, that she should just sell it and move into some elderly housing somewhere. You're terrible, Marcus said, but he was laughing too. I'm practical. Samuel's been a good provider, I'll give him that. But once he's gone, I'm done playing the grieving widow. His mother can grieve all she wants. Just not where I have to watch it. I felt like I was going to be sick. While I was sitting beside Samuel's hospital bed, holding his hand and telling him how much I loved him, his wife was planning her new life with another man, counting the money she'd collect from his death. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Everything I'd thought I knew about the last 3 years was a lie. Samuel hadn't pulled away from me because he was tired or overwhelmed. He'd pulled away because his wife had systematically poisoned him against me while stealing from our family and planning her escape. But now I understood why he'd left me the house. It wasn't just a gift born of guilt, as Ava had claimed. It was justice. It was his way of making sure she didn't profit from his death. His way of protecting me from her cruelty even after he was gone. I stood up on unsteady legs and walked to the bedroom, my heart racing with a mixture of grief and rage. The painting Samuel had mentioned hung above the bed. A landscape of mountains and trees that I'd always thought was beautiful but unremarkable. I felt around the edges until I found a hidden catch, and the painting swung open like a door, revealing a small digital safe. With trembling fingers I entered my birthday. The safe opened with a soft beep. Inside were more documents, more evidence of Ava's betrayal. But there was also something else. A USB drive labeled insurance, and a note in Samuel's handwriting that said, "Private investigators full report. All evidence of adultery and financial fraud. Use if necessary." I stared at that USB drive, understanding its significance. Samuel hadn't just left me a house. He'd left me ammunition. Evidence that could destroy Ava's plans completely, expose her lies, and prove to anyone who questioned it that I was the rightful owner of everything Samuel had wanted me to have. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than fear and sadness. I felt anger clean. Righteous anger at the woman who had poisoned my son's final months and planned to steal his legacy. Ava thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman who would roll over and accept whatever scraps she was offered. She thought she could intimidate me into giving up my home, my security, my connection to Samuel's memory. She was about to learn how wrong she was. I spent the entire night going through every document Samuel had left me. By dawn, I had a complete picture of Ava's deception, and it was worse than I had ever imagined. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She had been systematically robbing my dying son while pretending to be the devoted wife. The private investigator's report was thorough and damning. Photos of Ava entering hotels with Marcus Webb, a married executive at the marketing firm where she supposedly worked part-time. Bank records showing she had been siphoning money from their joint accounts for over 2 years. Credit card statements for expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and romantic trips. All purchased while Samuel was too sick to monitor their finances. Most shocking of all was the timeline. The affair had started just 6 months after their wedding, barely a year before Samuel's diagnosis. She had never loved him. She had been using him from the very beginning, and his illness had simply given her better cover for her lies. But it was the recordings that broke my heart. Hours of phone conversations between Ava and Marcus, captured by the investigator Samuel had hired. In them, she talked about my son like he was an inconvenience, a burden she had to endure until she could collect her inheritance. The doctors say he might have another year. I heard her say in one particularly cruel conversation, "I just have to keep playing the devoted wife act a little longer." Though honestly, the way he looks now, sometimes I can barely stand to be in the same room with him. "Is his mother still hanging around?" Marcus asked. "Unfortunately, the old bat thinks she's being helpful, but she's really just in the way. Always fussing over him, bringing him food he can't eat, acting like she knows better than the doctors. I'll be so glad when this is all over and I never have to see her again." They laughed together, as if my grief and Samuel's suffering were just amusing obstacles to their happiness. I had to stop the recording and go to the bathroom to throw up. The casual cruelty was overwhelming. While I had been working myself to exhaustion to help pay for Samuel's treatment, his wife had been mocking our family and planning her escape. By 7 in the morning I had made my decision. Called Ava. "Karen." Her voice was groggy with sleep. "What time is it? We need to talk." I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. Come to the house. Bring your parents. There's something you all need to see. Karen, if this is about the realtor yesterday. Just come, I interrupted. 1 hour. And Ava? You might want to bring Marcus Webb with you. There was dead silence on the other end of the line. Then in a voice I'd never heard her use before, small and frightened. What did you say? You heard me. 1 hour. I hung up before she could respond. I spent the next hour setting up Samuel's study like a courtroom. I arranged all the evidence on his desk. The bank statements, the hotel receipts, the private investigator's photos. I loaded the USB drive into his computer and queued up the most damning of the recorded conversations. Then I sat in his leather chair and waited. They arrived exactly an hour later, Ava, Patricia, and Robert. But they weren't alone. A man I didn't recognize was with them, tall and well-dressed with the kind of nervous energy that screamed guilt. Marcus Webb, I presumed. Ava looked terrible. Her usual perfect composure was cracked, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly. She knew. Somehow she knew I had discovered her secret. Karen, Patricia began in her usual condescending tone, I hope you've called us here to discuss a reasonable solution to this housing situation, because frankly, sit down, I said quietly, and something in my voice made them all freeze. All of you. Sit down and be quiet. They settled uneasily into the chairs I'd arranged in front of Samuel's desk. Ava kept glancing at Marcus, who was staring at the floor like he wanted to disappear. 3 weeks ago, I began. You told me that Samuel wasn't thinking clearly when he left me this house. You said his will was the product of guilt and poor judgment. You said I was being selfish and unrealistic to think I could keep his final gift to me. Karen, Ava started, but I held up my hand. I'm talking now. You've all had plenty of opportunities to speak. Now it's my turn. I picked up the first bank statement and held it up so they could all see it. This is Ava's personal checking account from 18 months ago. The same account that received a deposit of $5,000 every month from Executive Consulting Services. Interesting work, considering Ava told everyone she was too devastated by Samuel's illness to hold down a job. Ava's face went white. Beside her, Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For 3 years, I continued, I worked myself into the ground trying to help pay for Samuel's medical bills. I took extra cleaning jobs, I sold my mother's jewelry, I maxed out credit cards I'm still paying off. All because Ava told me how financially strapped you were, how much you needed help. I picked up another document. But according to these bank records, Ava was making more money than Samuel ever did. Money she was hiding from him. Money she was stealing from their joint accounts to fund her secret life. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. What are you talking about? I turned Samuel's computer monitor so they could all see the screen. I'm talking about this. I clicked play on one of the recorded conversations. Ava's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. The old bat thinks she's being helpful, but she's really just in the way. I'll be so glad when this is all over and I never have to see her again. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia stared at her daughter in shock. Robert's mouth hung open. Marcus looked like he wanted to crawl under the desk and hide. That's not, Ava started, but her voice cracked. There's more, I said, clicking to the next recording. Hours more. Would you like to hear the conversation where you and Marcus planned your trip to Napa Valley? The one you took while Samuel was in the hospital having his second surgery? Or maybe the one where you discussed how much money you'd inherit when he died? Ava shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger and panic. You can't use those. They're private conversations. Private conversations about committing adultery and financial fraud, I replied calmly. Samuel knew Ava. He knew about Marcus, he knew about the money, he knew about everything. That's why he changed his will. That's why he left everything to me instead of you. The room erupted in chaos. Patricia was demanding answers from Ava, who was shouting at Marcus to say something, anything. Robert sat in stunned silence, slowly realizing that his daughter-in-law was not the grieving widow she'd pretended to be. How long? Patricia's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She was staring at Ava with disgust and disbelief. How long were you cheating on my son-in-law while he was dying? Ava's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand. Samuel and I weren't happy. We hadn't been happy for years. I was lonely, I was scared. I needed someone who could actually be there for me. Be there for you? I stood up, my voice rising for the first time. While my son was fighting for his life, you were worried about being lonely. While he was enduring chemotherapy and radiation, you were upset that he couldn't entertain you. He was already pulling away from me. Ava screamed. He was obsessed with his illness, with dying, with making sure everyone remembered him as some kind of saint. There was no room in his life for what I needed. The words hung in the air like poison. Even Marcus looked shocked by her callousness. What you needed, I said quietly, was my son's death. Because that's what all of this was really about, wasn't it? You were just waiting for him to die, so you could start your real life with Marcus. Ava's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and frustration at being caught. I loved Samuel. I did everything I could to make him happy. You stole from him, I said, my voice steady and cold. You betrayed him. You isolated him from the people who actually loved him. And you counted the days until his death would make you rich. I clicked on another file and suddenly the room filled with Ava's voice again. The life insurance alone is $300,000, plus the house, plus his retirement accounts. We'll have enough to start over anywhere we want. Patricia made a choking sound. Oh my God, Ava. Oh my God. I want all of you out of my house, I said, standing up. Now. Karen, wait, Robert said, finding his voice for the first time. Maybe we can work something out. Ava made mistakes, but she's still family. No, I said firmly. She's not family. She never was family. She was a parasite who attached herself to my son and fed off him until he died. And now she's trying to do the same thing to me. I walked to the window and pointed outside. In the driveway, I could see a car I didn't recognize. Ava, I believe that's the private investigator Samuel hired. The same one who documented your affair and your theft. He's been watching this house for the past week, making sure you don't try to remove anything that doesn't belong to you. Ava looked out the window and went pale. The man standing beside the car was holding a camera with a telephoto lens, pointed directly at the house. Samuel protected me even after his death, I continued. He made sure I would have evidence of what you really are. He made sure I would be able to defend myself against your lies and your cruelty. I turned back to face them all. You have 30 minutes to get off my property. If you're not gone by then, I'm calling the police and showing them everything Samuel left for me. Everything. Marcus was already heading for the door, apparently having heard enough. Patricia and Robert sat in stunned silence, still trying to process what they'd learned about their daughter. But Ava wasn't finished. As her family and her lover abandoned her, she turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes. You think you've won? She hissed. You think Samuel actually loved you more than me? He felt sorry for you, Karen. You were a burden to him. Just like you'll be a burden to everyone else for the rest of your pathetic life. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had poisoned the last years of my son's life, who had stolen from our family, who had planned to erase me completely from Samuel's legacy. Samuel left me a letter, I said quietly. Would you like to know what it said? Before she could answer, I read from the letter Samuel had written. Mom, you were the best mother any son could ask for. You sacrificed everything for me, and I want you to have security for the rest of your life. Ava's face crumpled, and for the first time I saw real pain in her eyes. Not pain for what she'd done, but pain at realizing that Samuel had never loved her the way he'd loved me. Get out, I said softly. Get out and never come back. As they filed out of the study, leaving me alone with the evidence of Samuel's love and Ava's betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. My son had protected me one last time, and I finally understood the real meaning of his final gift. 6 months have passed since that terrible morning when Ava and her parents demanded I leave my own home. 6 months since I discovered the truth about my son's final years, and the woman who had stolen so much from both of us. Today, as I sit in Samuel's study, my study now, watching the sunrise paint the garden in shades of gold and pink, I can finally say that I understand what peace feels like. The house is quiet in a way it never was when Ava lived here. There's no tension crackling in the air, no feeling of walking on eggshells, No sense that I'm an unwelcome guest in my own space. For the first time in years, I wake up each morning without anxiety clawing at my chest. I've made changes, small ones that make the house feel more like home. I moved my books into Samuel's study, replaced the cold modern art Ava had chosen with family photos and paintings that make me smile. I planted new roses in the garden, varieties that Samuel and I used to admire at the Botanical Center when he was a child. The house feels alive again in a way it hadn't for a long time. The legal aftermath was simpler than I'd expected. When Samuel's lawyer reviewed all the evidence I'd found, he confirmed what I already knew: Samuel's will was ironclad, and Ava had no legal claim to any of his estate. The private investigator's documentation of her adultery and financial fraud made any challenge impossible. She could have fought it, spent money she didn't have on lawyers who would have told her she had no case, but even Ava wasn't that foolish. She disappeared quietly, the way people do when their lies catch up with them. I heard through Samuel's former neighbor that she moved to Portland with Marcus, though whether they're still together I neither know nor care. Patricia called me once, about a month after the confrontation, to apologize for her part in trying to force me from my home. I had no idea, she said, her voice heavy with shame. Ava told us you were being unreasonable, that Samuel had made a mistake because he was sick and confused. We believed her because we wanted to believe that our daughter wasn't capable of what she did. I accepted her apology because holding on to anger would have poisoned my own peace, but I didn't invite her to visit. Some bridges once burned are better left as ash. The financial challenges turned out to be manageable in ways I'd never imagined. Samuel had been more thorough in his planning than even I realized. In addition to the house, he'd left me a substantial life insurance policy and investments I'd known nothing about. Between that money and my Social Security, I could afford to maintain the house and even hire a cleaning service. A luxury I'd never imagined having after spending so many years providing that service for others. More importantly, Samuel had set up a trust that would ensure I could live comfortably for the rest of my life without worrying about property taxes or major repairs. He'd thought of everything, planned for every contingency. Even in death, he was still taking care of his mother. I found other gifts he'd left me, too. A letter hidden in the kitchen, tucked behind the cookie jar, telling me how much he'd loved my chocolate chip cookies and asking me to keep making them, to fill the house with those warm, sweet smells again. A note in his bedroom closet, wrapped around a photo of us from his high school graduation, telling me how proud he was to be my son. Each discovery was like receiving a hug from beyond the grave. A reminder that despite Ava's manipulation and lies, the bond between Samuel and me had never truly been broken. She had managed to damage it, to create distance and misunderstanding, but the love underneath had survived everything she'd thrown at it. I've started having visitors again, something I hadn't done in years. Mrs. Patterson, my former cleaning client, stops by for tea every Tuesday. We sit in the garden and talk about books, about her grandchildren, about anything except the painful past. She never asks about money or inheritance or makes me feel like my good fortune is undeserved. She simply enjoys my company and I enjoy hers. Samuel's friend Mike reached out to me a few months ago, apologizing for not staying in touch after the funeral. Ava told us you wanted to be left alone to grieve, he explained. She said you found it too painful to see Samuel's friends. Another lie, another way she'd isolated me from people who cared. But Mike and his wife come for dinner now, and they tell me stories about Samuel's college years that make me laugh until my sides ache. I've even started volunteering at the local hospice, helping families navigate the terrible journey I know so well. It's difficult work, emotionally draining, but it gives me a sense of purpose that goes beyond my own healing. When I sit with other mothers watching their children fight for their lives, I can offer something no textbook or training manual can provide: the understanding that comes from having walked that same dark path. Last week, a woman about my age broke down in the hospice waiting room after her son's latest round of chemotherapy failed to show improvement. I sat with her while she cried, held her hand while she raged against the unfairness of it all, and when she was ready to listen, I told her about Samuel. Not about Ava's betrayal or the inheritance drama, but about the joy of loving a child so completely that their pain becomes your pain, their fight becomes your fight. Does it ever get easier? She asked me through her tears. No, I told her honestly, but it gets different. The sharp edges of grief wear down into something you can carry. And if you're very lucky, you discover that love doesn't die with the person you're grieving. It just changes form. She squeezed my hand and said, "Thank you for understanding." Understanding. That's something I have in abundance now. Understanding of what Samuel went through. Understanding of why he made the choices he did. Understanding of how much he loved me even when Ava was doing everything in her power to convince him otherwise. I've forgiven him for the distance in those final months, for the missed phone calls and canceled visits, for allowing Ava to build walls between us. He was sick and manipulated and trying to protect me in the only way he knew how. He thought he was sparing me pain, not realizing that the isolation hurt more than any truth could have. But I've also forgiven myself. For not fighting harder to stay connected. For not seeing through Ava's lies. For sometimes doubting whether Samuel still loved me. Grief makes us vulnerable to manipulation, and Ava was an expert at exploiting that vulnerability. I was no match for someone willing to use my own love against me. The house has new sounds now. Laughter from dinner parties with friends. Classical music playing from the sound system Samuel installed, but I never knew how to use. The gentle splash of the fountain in the garden that I've finally learned to appreciate. Sometimes I play recordings of Samuel's voice. Old voicemails I saved from before he got sick. Back when he called just to chat about work or ask for my recipe for pot roast. I've started writing too. Nothing fancy, just memories of Samuel as a child. Stories I want to preserve before they fade. I write about the little boy who collected beetles in mason jars and insisted they were his pets. About the teenager who brought me breakfast in bed every Mother's Day, even the year he burned the eggs and set off the smoke alarm. About the young man who called me crying when his first serious girlfriend broke up with him, needing his mother to tell him that his heart would heal. These are the memories Ava tried to erase, the connection she tried to sever. But they're still here, still mine, still precious beyond any material inheritance. This morning I found myself looking out the kitchen window at the view that had so terrified Ava that day 6 months ago. When I pointed to that window and she saw the private investigator Samuel had hired, her face went white with the realization that her carefully constructed lies were crumbling. She thought she was looking at her destruction, and in a way she was right. But I wasn't pointing at her destruction. I was pointing at my salvation. The proof that my son had never stopped loving me, never stopped protecting me, never stopped being the thoughtful, caring man I'd raised him to be. Samuel's gift wasn't just this house, beautiful as it is. His gift was the truth. The truth about Ava's betrayal, the truth about his own feelings, the truth about the family we'd been before cancer and manipulation changed everything. That truth has set me free in ways I never expected. Free from guilt about my relationship with Samuel. Free from doubt about my worth as a mother. Free from the financial insecurity that had defined most of my adult life. Free to live with dignity and peace for whatever years I have left. Sometimes, late at night when the house is completely quiet, I sit in Samuel's chair and talk to him. I tell him about my day. About the roses blooming in the garden, about the book I'm reading or the friend who stopped by for tea. I thank him for his final gift, for thinking of everything, for loving me enough to protect me even after he was gone. And sometimes, in the silence that follows, I can almost hear his voice saying what he couldn't say in those final months. I love you, Mom. I always did. I always will. The inheritance they thought would break me has given me the life I never dared to dream of. Not because of the money or the house, but because it came with a certain knowledge that I was loved completely by the person who mattered most. Ava thought she was getting revenge when she tried to force me from my home. She thought she was exposing my weakness, my inability to take care of myself. Instead, she gave me the opportunity to discover my own strength, my own worth, my own capacity for grace under pressure. I am 63 years old. I am Samuel's mother. I am the woman who raised a man capable of love and loyalty and justice, even in the face of betrayal. I am the woman who survived my husband's death, my son's illness, and my daughter-in-law's cruelty. I am the woman who refused to be erased, refused to be silenced, refused to be forgotten. And I am finally peacefully completely free.